This video begins a series on Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, which I will be reading in the translation by Terence Irwin from Hackett in the third edition. I will be citing this by the book and chapter and the section numbers that have been editorially introduced here, not the Becker numbers, the standard numbers. I will omit those simply to save time. So you'll want to get this particular edition if you want to follow along with my citations. Aristotle begins the Nicomachean Ethics by noting certain appearances or seemings. He says, this is Book 1, Chapter 1, Section 1, every craft and every discipline, and likewise action and decision, seems to seek some good. That is why some people were right to describe the good as what everything seeks. Every craft, discipline, and action seems to seek some good. So he's describing the appearances here. This is the way in which he begins his inquiry in ethical theory. What are the ways in which the phenomena appear to us when we're inquiring into ethical matters? Well, we might start by looking at the way in which every action, every craft, every science, every discipline seems to have some good that it aims at. What does he mean by this? What he means is that every craft is defined by or gets its identity as what it is in reference to some good that defines what it ought to be. For example, carpentry is defined by and gets its identity as carpentry, as opposed to, say, basket weaving, by a particular good, namely the good of home building. Aristotle assumes, or perhaps he arrives at the conclusion by induction, that the good of every activity is something called an end. An end. So that's the next question for us to ask. What is an end? Aristotle says, section 2, but the ends appear to differ. So he's implicitly assuming here that the good that he referred to in section 1 refers to ends. The ends appear to differ, for some are activities and others are products apart from the activities. And where there are ends apart from the actions, the products are by nature better than the activities. What is this end? Well, first of all, an end is not a purpose, if by that we mean it's something that involves a conscious intention or an idea in the mind. So we shouldn't confuse an end with a purpose. If by purpose we understand, as we usually do, a conscious intention. Which would be some form of mental content, some idea in the mind. Rather, what an end is a goal. And we might keep this in mind by thinking about the connection between an end and the idea of the ending of an activity. An end is a goal in the sense that it is that which ends the activity. It's the stopping point of the activity, the natural stopping point, we might say. So it ends the activity. It is the stopping point. It implies, as we will see, completeness or perfection. The end is reached not just when the activity ceases for whatever reason. So an activity of, let's say, carpentry might cease because the carpenter got ill or ran out of funds for building materials, or any number of reasons. There might be a war that interrupted the construction, and that might stop the activity. And that kind of a stopping point isn't the end. Rather, the end is the stopping point that implies completeness or perfection. And I say implies completeness or perfection because the end might not be reached or perfectly reached, even though the activity is aiming at it. But nonetheless, the end in its full nature, we might say, implies completeness or perfection. And that happens when the norm governing the activity is satisfied. So the idea is that there's a certain norm that governs all activities that Aristotle mentions. Craft, disciplined actions, and decisions imply norms governing these activities. Again, to go back to our example of carpentry, the norm governing the activity of carpentry is the completion of a certain type of product, namely a house, and also certain standards that would apply to that house, such that just digging a hole in the ground doesn't count as a house, for example. There are certain standards that a house has to meet. So there's a norm governing the activity. The norm governing the activity is satisfied when the end is achieved. So that's the idea of an end. An end is not a purpose or a conscious intention. It is a goal. It ends the activity, and that's an easy way to remember what this sense of end is and how it connects with other uses of the term end. It's the stopping point, but not just any arbitrary stopping point. It implies the completion or perfection when the norm governing the activity is satisfied. That's our concept of an end. Just take a look at that one for another couple seconds just to get that down, okay? So this is a very important notion for Aristotle, obviously. The good is going to have to do with ends. Now, it's natural to think of the ends as the output or the product of an activity, as we might think of the house as the end of carpentry. The house is a product, it's the output of carpentry. However, Aristotle immediately notes that activities themselves can also be ends, and that's a very important point. An end isn't just a thing, a material object like a house. An end can also be an activity itself, or it'd be better to say activities themselves can also be ends. For example, this would be true of many recreational games. Skiing, for instance. The end of skiing isn't just to get down the mountain. If that were the case, people wouldn't pay good money in order to get up to the mountain, top of the mountain in the first place. Rather, the end of the activity of skiing is the activity of skiing itself. However, when the end is a separate product, the activity must be understood as subordinate in goodness to the end. The activity is for the end, for the sake of the end. Carpentry is subordinate to the house that is its product. It is for the sake of the house, not for its own sake. Engaging in a lot of carpentry is worthless, if not senseless. If carpentry is to have a kind of integrity as a type of action to begin with, it has to at least be aiming at producing a nice, well-built house when all the dust settles. Otherwise, at the extreme, it wouldn't even be carpentry. If I'm, just digging a pit, and you ask me, what am I doing? And I say, I'm engaging in carpentry. You would scratch your head and wonder whether I even knew what carpentry was. And why is that? Because carpentry is subordinate to the end of having a well-built house. If my activity isn't pursuing that end, it's not properly identified as that activity. So the norm is governing the activity in this way. The end has a kind of priority over the activity when the end aims at a particular product. Of course, if it doesn't, if it's just a matter of an activity that's engaged in for its own sake, then the activity itself is not subordinate. It's identical to the end. And so you wouldn't have that same type of relation. Aristotle is concerned with the hierarchy of activities and ends. Of course, not only are there activities which are pursued for the sake of products, and not only are those activities subordinate to their products, but there are also products that are themselves typically subordinate to other products. And in addition, activities can be subordinate to other activities. And certainly it would follow logically that is, if an activity is subordinate to a product and that product is subordinate to some other product, then the activity that produces the second product is also going to be superior to the original activity. So to make this more concrete, we can look at the possibilities that Aristotle considers in sections 3 and 4, where he says, now since there are many actions, crafts, and sciences, the ends turn out to be many as well. For health is the end of medicine, a boat of boat building, victory of generalship, the wealth of household management. But some of these pursuits are subordinate to some one capacity. For instance, bridle making and every other science producing equipment for horses are subordinate to horsemanship. Well, this and every action in warfare in turn are subordinate to generalship. And in the same way, other pursuits are subordinate to further ones. In all such cases, then, the ends of the ruling science are more choice-worthy than all the ends subordinate to them, since the lower ends are pursued for the sake of the higher. Here, it does not matter whether the ends of the actions are the activities themselves or something apart from them, as in the sciences we have mentioned. So because bridles are for the sake of riding horses, bridle making is an activity that's subordinate to horsemanship. Because, as Aristotle conceives it, the ultimate end for which horses are domesticated is usefulness in warfare. Horsemanship is an activity that's subordinate to generalship. We can easily visualize how such hierarchical relationships of activities could be multiplied if we surveyed all the activities that a typical society engages in. So I don't think we need to duplicate the example, but it does naturally raise a question, this sort of hierarchical relationship of activities and ends. And the question is, what, if anything, is the ultimate activity or end? What, if anything, is the ultimate activity or end? If anything, is there an ultimate activity or end? And this would be the highest good. So you have the notion of the highest good as the ultimate end, which could be an activity or a product. So what is this? What is the highest good or the ultimate end? And then, of course, we have the prior question, is there a highest good or ultimate end? So how would Aristotle answer this question? Moving on to chapter 2, he says, if then the things achievable by action have some end that we wish for because of itself, and we wish for other things because of this end, and we do not choose everything because of something else, for if we do, it will go on without limit, so that desire will prove to be empty and futile, it is clear that this end will be the good, that is to say, the best good. Now, the sense of this passage is not clear. It seems that Aristotle is arguing something like this. So I will reconstruct this argument by repeating each premise as I understand it. And this is, of course, just one possible reading. But I'll read out the premises, repeat them, and repeat the whole argument so you can have it before you. Premise 1. Either we act as a means to achieving some end outside our action itself, or else we choose an act because of itself. Premise 1. Either we act as a means to achieving some end outside of our action itself, or else we choose an act because of itself. Premise 2. Those acts that we choose because of themselves require no further explanation. Premise 2. Those acts that we choose because of themselves require no further explanation. Premise 3. When we act as a means to achieving some end outside of our action itself, this end must eventually lead to something that we wish for because of itself, or else our desire is futile, that is, our act is unintelligible. Premise 3, when we act as a means to achieving some end outside our action itself, this end must eventually lead to something that we wish for because of itself, or else our desire is futile. That is, our act is unintelligible. Now, this third premise might require a brief bit of commentary. The basic idea here is that, well, it makes sense to say that I'm pursuing this action for the sake of this end, if the end itself is one that is not done for its own sake. It too needs to have an explanation in order to be intelligible. So it certainly makes sense for me to say, I'm waiting here for the bus, or I'm riding in the bus in order to go to the dentist. That makes sense of my action of waiting for the bus or riding in the bus. But of course, it just raises another question, which is, why am I going to the dentist? And this is not something that anyone does for its own sake. Presumably, it's in order to, let's say, get a root canal, which is definitely not something anyone does for its own sake. But eventually, you can say, well, I'm getting a root canal for the sake of my overall dental health, and that might be thought of as something that's worth having for its own sake, arguably at least. But the point is the general one, that there needs to be some stopping point of the justifications of my action where we're stopping with something that is done for its own sake. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. If you're saying that I'm doing this not for its own sake, but you can't give a reason for the sake of what you're doing it, essentially you're saying you're just acting in a kind of random and irrational way. That's the point. If I just go to the dentist, no, not for its own sake. I don't go to the dentist for its own sake, but I don't go for any other reason either. That's a head scratcher. Okay? So this is the basic idea of premise 3. When we act as a means to achieving some end outside our action itself, this end must eventually lead to something that we wish for because of itself, or else our desire is futile, by which I think we can interpret Aristotle as saying that our act is unintelligible. Premise 4, therefore every act will aim at something we wish for because of itself. Premise 4, therefore every act will aim at something we wish for because of itself. And then the fifth premise, call this thing the best good. Which is the conclusion. The conclusion really is logically speaking, premise 4, but the final point to make is that this act that aims at something we wish for because of itself, this thing wished for is the best good. So the overall argument again reads this way: either we act as a means to achieving some end outside our action itself, or else we choose an act because of itself. Those acts we choose because of itself require no further explanation. When we act as a means to achieving some end outside of our action itself, this end must eventually lead to something we wish for because of itself, or otherwise our act is unintelligible. Therefore, every act will aim at something we wish for because of itself. And we can call this thing the best good. Now, for all that Aristotle has shown here, there might be several best goods. In other words, there's a picture here where you have something like this. You perform several actions. Each one of these dots represents an action, which you perform for the sake of some end, which again might be an activity, another activity, or a product. So each of these performed for the sake of this. And then some of these we'll make stars out of them. Some of these are done for their own sake. Then some of these other ones you have to have a further end, let's say, but then eventually they all end up with something that's done for its own sake. But notice that there are several stars here. There's not one ultimate or highest good. Which of these is the ultimate or highest good? Well, as far as this picture goes, you can't tell whether any of them is. So this picture is different from, let's say, the kind of picture that you might expect if there were an ultimate end, which would say that we have something like this, where all of our actions ultimately lead up to one final ultimate end. But this argument hasn't shown this. if that's what it's intended to show. Because it's unclear how these different best goods, which is all the argument shows, would be arranged hierarchically, or if they can be at all, since they are all ex hypothesi, wished for their own sakes. Certainly this argument does not show that there's one single thing that all our actions must aim at. It really shows that in order for our actions to make sense to us, they must eventually be seen as leading to something that's desired for its own sake. Unfortunately, in the text as we have it, Aristotle appears to draw a stronger conclusion because he immediately goes on to speak as if it establishes a single target that all our desires might aim at. So he refers in section 2 there to this: surely knowledge of this good also carries great weight for one's way of life. And if we know it, we are more likely, like archers who have a target to aim at, to hit the right mark. If so, we should try to grasp and outline at any rate what the good is and which is its proper science or capacity. Now, we might simply take Aristotle to be speaking hypothetically here. If there is one single good at which all our actions should aim, then it would be really, really useful for us to know what that is in order to maximize our chances at achieving it. Further, Aristotle immediately goes on to produce another argument that he thinks leads to the conclusion that there is a single highest good. And it goes something like this, and I'll follow the same procedure here. Premise 1. Each science has its own distinctive end, which is its own distinctive good. Premise 1. Each science has its own distinctive end, which is its own distinctive good. Premise 2. If there is a highest science, then there will be a highest good corresponding to it. Premise 2. If there is a highest science, then there will be a highest good corresponding to it. Premise 3. There is a highest science, namely the political science, which is the science of the polis, which is politics in the sense of statescraft, the art of running the city well. I'll say more about that in a bit. But premise 3, there is a highest science, namely the political science. Premise 4, conclusion. Therefore, there is a highest good, namely whatever is the end of political science. So step 4, conclusion. Therefore, there is a highest good, namely whatever is the end of political science. So the argument is like this. Each science has its own distinctive end, which is its own distinctive good. If there is a highest science, then there will be a highest good corresponding to it. There is a highest science, namely the political science. Conclusion, therefore, there is a highest good, namely whatever is the end of the political science. Now, the first premise of this argument, that each science has its own distinctive end, which is its own distinctive good, is uncontroversial based upon what has gone before, but the second and third premises might be thought to be controversial. As for the second premise, which is that if there is a highest science, there will be a highest good corresponding to it, one might question whether the good of the highest science would be the highest good overall. One might challenge that premise and say that the good of the highest science would be, at best, only a good that is higher in some sense than the good of all the other sciences, but not necessarily the highest overall. After all, there's more to life than science. So I assume that the good of the highest science would be the highest good, period. Now, Aristotle would reply to this challenge by appealing to the specifics of the highest good of the highest science. This reply would rely implicitly on an idea that we see implicit in section 8, which is that man is a political animal. Let's look at section 8. For even if the good is the same for a city as for an individual, still the good of the city is apparently a greater or more complete good to acquire and preserve. For while it is satisfactory to acquire and preserve the good even for an individual, it is finer and more divine to acquire and preserve it for a people and for cities. Now you can interpret this in various ways. You could interpret it in a way that is sort of utilitarian, that the many are worth more than the few. But as we'll go on to see, that isn't very consonant with Aristotle's overall perspective on things. So I'm suggesting that we would interpret this in terms of this idea of man being a political animal, which is one of these famous dictums that Aristotle is associated with. It's an idea that he states in his Politics, the follow-on work to the Nicomachean Ethics, as you might view it. Man as a political animal is meant in the sense in which one might say that an animal has its own proper habitat and can thrive only in that habitat. An animal has its own proper habitat and can thrive only in that habitat. You wouldn't expect an animal, like an alligator, for example, to thrive in the desert, or a monkey to thrive on the tundra. Similarly, you wouldn't expect a human being to thrive, Aristotle would say, except in a polis. So political here, of course, refers to the polis, which, of course, is the city-state. So we can think of this generally as the political society, and Aristotle would regard the ideal political society as being the city-state. But we can think of this more broadly as referring to political society in general. A political society for Aristotle is going to be paradigmatically a city-state like the kinds the ancient Greeks built. So to say that man is a political animal is to say that man's own good is bound up with the good of his polis, or city, whether it is well-governed, safe, and prosperous or not. These are not separate things. The fate of an individual is bound up with the fate of his city. His own good is bound up with the good of the city. The science that ensures this, the welfare of the city, the polis, is political science. That's what Aristotle means by political science, not political science in the modern sense of an academic discipline. It's one of the so-called social sciences that employs quantitative analytical methods in order to pursue various questions about what the factual basis is of certain claims about a particular government or political system and so forth. For him, political science is actually a kind of technical endeavor, closer to what we would probably today call public policy research. But it's also practical governing. So it's the science of governing the city well, of governing the polis well. And he calls this the controlling science, the controlling science. Aristotle is very much influenced by the paternalistic conception of the city-state that was taken for granted in his time. A city is like a family, with the ruler or rulers acting like fathers of an ancient Greek family, responsible for the welfare of their charges, which would include not only their wife and children, but also various other dependents, servants, and so forth in a large family household. And so this person is going to be in control of every aspect of the lives of those people under them, and they're going to control those lives. And in this view, then, by extension, political science is in control of the city and also in control of everything that goes on in the city, in control of all the activities, including the other sciences. Political science is the controlling science in the sense of being in control of the other sciences. As he says in section 6 there, for it prescribes which of the sciences ought to be studied in cities, and which ones each class in the city should learn, and how far. Indeed, we see that even the most honored capacities, generalship, household management, and rhetoric, for instance, are subordinate to it. So he's obviously describing an ideal here, but the point that he's making is that ideally, in the city, you will have a kind of centralized authority that will determine which sciences exist in order to benefit the welfare of the city as a whole. And all of those sciences are going to have to, as it were, justify themselves by appeal to the benefits that they provide for the city as a whole. At this point, Aristotle reveals what the present work that you're holding in your hands is all about. It's a work of political science. Or more exactly, it's a part of political science. It's significant and distinctive of his approach to what we call ethical theory that Aristotle does not distinguish it from politics. Politics deals with the larger question of what sort of society we should live in and how it should be governed and what sort of laws it should have. Ethics contributes to this by studying the human good, which is what should be promoted in and by the polis. Now, the word ethics derives from the Greek ethos. You can see a detailed account of this in the glossary that Urban provides to this edition of the Nicomachean Ethics. But ethos is translated by him as habit. It could also be translated as custom. And thinking of this or reminding ourselves of this helps us to see the connection between the ethical and the political, such that we can speak, I think, in a kind of unitary way of what I would call the ethico-political. This is the subject, really, of the Nicomachean Ethics, the ethico-political, with an emphasis on the first part, but always keeping in view, in farther view, the connection between the ethical and the political, the connection between the habits and customs that individuals and a people engage in and the welfare of the city, the polis. There's an intimate internal connection between the ethical and the political from an ancient perspective. Insofar as the ethical concerns of individuals, the habits of individuals, are intimately bound up with the customs of the city. The habits of individuals, unless the individual is an eccentric, are largely the habits of his or her city. And the habits and the customs of the city are, from an ancient perspective, and still to some extent today, the main subject matter of the legislation and ruling decisions that politics are concerned with. We still see this today, ways in which government tries to influence the habits of individuals, getting them, for example, to reduce their consumption in certain ways that are viewed as being beneficial to the society. So for this reason, I'm going to occasionally use this term ethico-political to describe the object of the science that Aristotle is concerned with. This leads us to the first discussion question. Do you agree with Aristotle's view of the essential interrelationship between the highest good of the individual and the highest good of the state, we'll call it? That is, the social political order in which the person exists. If you don't agree, why not? If you agree, do you think this places the onus on the rulers of the state to guarantee the welfare of their citizens? Does it absolve individuals of any personal responsibility for their own well-being? In what way might a conception of the ideal political society influence one's ethical conceptions, and vice versa? In what way might one's ethical conceptions influence one's conception of the ideal political society? So obviously that's a very broad question, but it's worth thinking about these fundamental issues at this point as we begin the Nicomachean Ethics. So once again, first discussion question, do you agree with Aristotle's view of the essential interrelationship between the highest good of the individual and the highest good of the state, or the socio-political order in which a person exists? If you don't agree, why not? If you agree, do you think this places the onus on the rulers of the state to guarantee the welfare of their citizens? Does it absolve individuals of any personal responsibility for their own well-being? In what way might a conception of the ideal political society influence one's ethical conceptions, or vice versa? All right, so this leads us to chapter 3, which concerns the method of political science, the methodology of this work, the Nicomachean Ethics. The fundamental question of political science is, how are we to discover what the end of this science is, which will give us an idea of what the good we are seeking is. Chapter 3 defers this substantive question and asks rather about the nature of the answer we seek, and particularly the type of exactness, proof, or argumentation that will be appropriate for this science. So, the beginning, he reads this way: but our discussion will be adequate if we make things perspicuous, that is clear, and perspicuous enough to accord with the subject matter. Perspicuous enough to accord with the subject matter. For we should not seek the same degree of exactness in all sorts of arguments alike, any more than in the products of different crafts. Now, fine and just things which political science examines differ and vary so much as to seem to rest on convention only, not on nature. But goods also vary in the same way because they result in harm to many people. For some have been destroyed because of their wealth, others because of their bravery. So, Aristotle here is striking a middle path between two extremes. And the two extremes we might describe as relativism, which I spoke of earlier in the discussion of the Sophists and Plato's Gorgias. On the one hand, relativism, and on the other hand, Platonism. So, Platonism, in the particular sense in which Aristotle is trying to steer clear of it, we'll discuss in some more detail by the end of this video. Relativism claims that there can be no true political science since there's no general scientific answer to the question, what is the good of the polis? There's no general scientific answer to the question, what is the good of the polis? This is what the relativists think. Why? Well, according to relativism, the question, what is the good of the polis, is going to be answered based upon the conventions of the various cities regarding what Aristotle here calls the fine and just things. So in Athens, for example, it's considered to be a fine thing, a noble thing, to engage in learning and to value learning above everything. In Sparta, famously, military discipline is regarded as the finest thing. In the city of Corinth, stereotypically, luxury is regarded as the finest thing in the city of Corinth, and so on. And so the relativist is going to say there's no generally accepted answer here as to what the good of the polis is, because different cities had different customary or habitual opinions about what the fine and just things are. Now, Aristotle rejects relativism. He argues that just because different people have different opinions about the good doesn't mean there's no truth of the matter. So that's when he says, goods vary in the same way because they result in harm to many people. Some have been destroyed by their wealth, others because of their bravery. Just because some people have been destroyed by their wealth, some people have been destroyed by their bravery, doesn't mean that wealth and bravery aren't good. Obviously, it was bad for that particular person, but that doesn't mean that in general they're not good. So that says it's going to tell something to Aristotle about the way in which we should seek answers to this question about what the good for the city is. And I'll return to that in a second. But first, I want to get on the table the other alternative, the other extreme that Aristotle wants to reject, and this we might call Platonism. This is the opinion of Plato and his disciples, in agreement, one might add, with most modern totalitarian policymakers, the opinion that there's one precise, one-size-fits-all fix to every city, a formula for the good of a city that applies precisely to all. This Platonism seems to be based upon an infatuation with the model of mathematics and the view that all science must be modeled on mathematics in order to be a science at all. So, is ethical theory, is politics to be modeled on mathematics? Aristotle would say no. He also rejects this extreme. Rather, the political science must attend to the nuances of each individual case, whether it is the particular city or the particular individual. There is ethical political truth, but it cannot be ascertained by applying some algorithm. In each case, one must consider the specific particularities in a way that doesn't allow of some kind of simple formula that you could apply to every case. In this way, each city, each person, and perhaps each circumstance in which a judgment of the good is called for is like an individual work of art that has to be judged entirely on its own merits and not as a member of a general class of things. So that would be Aristotle's position. There is ethical truth, but it's not the kind of truth that we find in mathematics. So he says in section 4 there, and since this is our subject and these are premises, we shall be satisfied to indicate the truth roughly and in outline, And since our subject and our premises are things that hold good usually, we shall be satisfied to draw conclusions of the same sort. Each of our claims then ought to be accepted in the same way, for the educated person seeks exactness in a given area to the extent that the nature of the subject allows. For apparently it is just as mistaken to demand demonstrations from a rhetorician as it is to accept merely persuasive arguments from a mathematician. This position, though, does raise pressing questions about authority. If there's not some ethico-political algorithm that can be proven through logical demonstration and then subsequently applied to individual cases to render a well-grounded rational judgment, then what authority is ethico-political judgment based on? What authority is ethico-political judgment based upon? To see Aristotle's approach to ethico-political authority, the analogy with the judgment of a work of art may be helpful. We generally accept that there are authoritative experts who are qualified to judge the quality of a work of art. To be sure, no such judgment is ever exact or certain, and of course such experts disagree, and there may even be a dispute over who is an expert. But one thing at least is clear. A necessary condition of being an expert on a work of art is having a lot of experience with works of that type. And while there may not be perfect consensus or agreement about precisely every aspect of a work among those who are experienced, there is in fact a broad agreement. No one, for example, with a significant experience of Western painting thinks that Rembrandt was a poor painter. And it's this degree of exactitude and this sort of basis for authority that Aristotle seems to have in mind as appropriate to the ethico-political sphere. So he says, beginning section 5, further, each person judges rightly what he knows and is a good judge about that. Hence, the good judge in a given area is the person educated in that area. And the unqualifiedly good judge is the person educated in every area. And he says this is the reason why a youth is not a suitable student for political science, since he lacks experience of the actions in life. And it doesn't matter, he goes on to say, whether the person is young in years or immature in character. The deficiency doesn't depend upon their age, but whether they've been cultivated, whether they've been educated, and in other words, whether they have the appropriate experience in the ethical sphere, in the ethico-political sphere. The person who is experienced in the ethico-political sphere is the one who is qualified to be a judge, just as the person who is experienced in a particular area of art would be qualified to judge works within that genre of art. That's the nature of the authority. It's different from mathematics, so you can't demonstrate. You can't demonstrate that Rembrandt is a good painter. There's certain things you can point to, but you can't demonstrate it in the way in which you can prove a mathematical theorem. And the same is true in the ethico-political sphere. You can't prove or demonstrate logically ethical or political conclusions. But nonetheless, there is truth in this sphere, Aristotle is convinced, and it comes from relying upon the judgment and the authority that comes from those who are experienced. So this brings us to chapter 4. After this diversion into methodological questions, Aristotle returns to the question of the good that political science seeks, which, remember, we're following out the idea that since political science is the controlling science, the highest science, this good, this end will be the highest good. Also, since the individual's good depends upon the good of the polis, the end that is concerned with the welfare of or good of the polis will also be the end that is at least a necessary condition for the goodness of individuals as well. So to answer this question, now Aristotle can draw upon the conclusions of the previous chapter, that what we must seek are the opinions of those who are experienced or cultivated about ethico-political matters. That's how we're going to advance in this inquiry into the highest good. We're going to survey the opinions of those who are experienced or cultivated about ethico-political matters. In modern times, who do we say are the experienced or cultivated in these matters? And I think even today we would probably point to two separate classes of people, which are also the two separate classes of people, roughly speaking, that Aristotle mentions, with a bit of uncertainty in our case about how to rank them, which is an uncertainty that Aristotle wouldn't have, as we'll see. But who are these two classes of people I'm referring to? Well, on the one hand, we're inclined to think that there are people who have specialized education in ethics or politics, advanced degrees, impressive resumes of public service and academic positions and so on, the ones who have cultivated a higher degree of political knowledge. On the other hand, our democratic culture teaches us that every mentally competent adult counts as an expert of a sort or as a reliable authority when it comes to ethico-political questions. William F. Buckley had a famous anti-elitist quip that you may have heard of. He said, "I'd rather be governed by the first 100 people in the Boston phone book than by the Harvard faculty." And I think certainly every American can relate to that sort of anti-elitist sentiment because it's part of our American political culture. Now, Aristotle, we need to acknowledge, was clearly an elitist. He's clearly an elitist. But he did not discount the hoi polloi, the many, as it's translated. If the hoi polloi agreed with the cultivated, for Aristotle, this at least provided extra credence to an opinion. And perhaps if the hoi polloi disagreed with the cultivated, I should say, well, that's reason to just reject the opinion of the hoi polloi as a kind of vulgar opinion. But we should at least proceed with caution in examining the opinions of the cultivated, particularly if they disagree among each other. But the way Aristotle is proceeding here is by beginning with opinions about what the highest good is in a way that allows him to at least narrow the field down so that we can then begin to examine these particular options within the narrower field and weigh them against one another on philosophical grounds so that we're not just groping around blindly in the dark, but we have at least a circumscribed set of options. So when it comes to the highest good, he says, this is section 6 and 4. Oops. Sorry, section 2 and 4. As far as its name goes, most people practically agree, for both the many and the cultivated call it happiness, it being the highest good. As far as the name goes, most people agree, both the many and the cultivated call the highest good happiness, and they suppose that living well and doing well are the same thing as being happy. But about what happiness is, they disagree, and the many do not give the same answer as the wise. So this is referring here to what the American political philosopher John Rawls called a concept-conception distinction. A concept-conception distinction. A concept of something specifies in a broad and generic way the role that the thing is supposed to play in our system of concepts. So we could say this specifies the general role of a thing. That would be the concept of a thing. And he says happiness is a concept of the highest good, we might say. That is to say that everyone agrees that whatever the highest good is, it's going to answer to the name of happiness. Happiness is going to be the highest good. But they differ, we might say, in their conceptions of the highest good, which spells out in specific detail how the concept is supposed to play the role. So that's the distinction. The concept specifies the general role of a thing, and the conception of the thing spells out in specific detail how the concept is supposed to play that role. So Aristotle can be read as saying that the many and the cultivated agree that happiness is the highest good, but they don't agree about what happiness specifically consists of. And this is how the generic concept of happiness is inadequate by itself without a conception of happiness that specifies exactly how happiness is supposed to play the role of the highest good. So the differences are pointed out in section 3. For the many think it is one of the obvious and evident things. They think that happiness is one of the obvious and evident things, such as pleasure, wealth, or honor. Some take it to be one thing, others another. Indeed, the same person often changes his mind. For when he has fallen ill, he thinks happiness is health. And when he has fallen into poverty, he thinks it is wealth. And when they are conscious of their own ignorance, they admire anyone who speaks of something grand and above their heads. Above their heads. So the many and the wise differ in their conceptions of happiness, although they all agree with the general concept that happiness is the highest good. Many tend to think it's something obvious, whereas the wise, think here of the philosophers, favor less obvious conceptions, such as the possession of rare intellectual knowledge. For example, in Plato's contemplation of the forms. More on that in a minute. However, even some of the wise, it will turn out, side with the masses in favoring one of their conceptions that make happiness an obvious thing, as we'll see. But even among the obvious things, conceptions differ. The leading conceptions of happiness tend to be pleasure, wealth, or honor, fame, we might say. And conceptions of happiness show a tendency to fluctuate with one's condition in life. Famously, human beings tend to imagine that happiness lies in what they don't have, especially if they feel its absence as painful. In the case of sickness, happiness is imagined to consist in being healthy. Oh, only to be healthy again. When you feel humiliated or deficient because of your ignorance, you long for knowledge. So it seems that the fact that everyone agrees that happiness is the highest good doesn't by itself get us very far in our inquiry into the highest good. It doesn't tell us what the best sort of life is or how the polis is supposed to promote the best sort of existence. And some philosophers, even very significant ones like Rousseau and Kant, have thought that this shows that a happiness-based ethic wouldn't be of any practical value. But most have found this to be too extreme a position. So how are we to resolve this apparent impasse? Aristotle's strategy, as he says in section 6, is to examine the opinions or common knowledge of those brought up in fine habits. Those brought up in fine habits. From a modern perspective, this is likely to strike us as arbitrary and a kind of elitist snobbery. Happiness is subjective, we say. Everyone determines his or her own conception of happiness based upon their own personal experience and personality type. Who is Aristotle to claim scientific status for the supposedly well brought up? Isn't this just an arbitrary prejudice and elitist snobbery? To see why, from Aristotle's perspective, it's not arbitrary, it's necessary to take note of the differences between our modern concept of happiness and the Greek concept that is translated by this word, which is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. And so we might chart here some distinctive metrics across which these differ. 4 in particular, which I will call stability, objectivity, universality, and divinity. And so the claim is that happiness and eudaimonia differ in these respects. So the first, stability. And here what I have in mind is that modern happiness we tend to regard as less stable than eudaimonia was regarded. So happiness is regarded in our modern sense as something like an episodic state. You might be happy today. Yesterday you were unhappy. Tomorrow you'll be unhappy again. It fluctuates, goes up and down. Even from hour to hour or moment to moment, we might describe ourselves as being, I was happy this morning, but this afternoon I'm unhappy. Whereas that doesn't make as much sense for eudaimonia. It's more stable. This is something that applies to the whole life. And in this respect, we might translate eudaimonia less as happiness and more as something like success in life. Success in life. I'll underline this as a possible alternative translation of eudaimonia than happiness, because it contains this idea of having a successful life, which of course is very different from what your episodic state is at any particular moment. Also, with regard to objectivity, we tend to regard happiness as not very objective at all. It's subjective. You in particular have a very privileged position when it comes to determining whether or not you are happy. Social scientists who want to measure people's happiness usually just send out a survey and ask them to report on whether they're happy or not. It's a very subjective thing. Whereas eudaimonia is different. This is more objective. And in this respect, it's more like what we might describe as flourishing. Flourishing. It's not just how you feel, but are you flourishing in the way in which, let's say, a withered plant or let's say a tree that's got rot is objectively not a flourishing plant or tree. And if the tree had conscience, it wouldn't matter how they felt about it. We would say objectively, it's not just not flourishing. So that's why this is another alternative translation. Instead of happiness, we could translate eudaimonia as flourishing. Third, we have universality. And here universality is less of a factor in the case of happiness and more of a factor in the case of eudaimonia. In the case of eudaimonia, it's more of we might describe as a species-related factor. It's not just something that is related to our individual subjectivity. We're very tolerant in the modern era of people having wildly different conceptions of happiness that they choose for themselves and that are relative to their individual differences in personality. Whereas the idea of eudaimonia is more focused on the idea of what is happy for man as man qua man, human being qua human being. It's species related as opposed to individual related, more universal. And then finally, the daimon in eudaimonia here, if we circle that, this is the word from which we get our word demon, but it's basically the idea of a spirit. And eu is the term that designates something like well or good, if it uses the modifier. So eudaimonia is the state in which one's companion spirit, as we might describe it, is favoring you. You have a good companion spirit. You think in terms of an ancient person, you might have a demon, an evil companion spirit that's messing with you and making everything go wrong in your life. But if you have a good spirit, then things are going well. Eudaimonia is the state of having a good companion spirit that's making your life go well. And so there's kind of a connection here again with success in life. So there's this connection with divinity. This is a weak relation in our modern sense. We tend to think of happiness as often in very hedonistic terms or in terms of our subjective choices and values and completely secular conception. Whereas this one is going to have a strong relation. It relates one to one's companion spirit, as you might describe it. So Aristotle's view isn't expecting us to accept all of these aspects of eudaimonia. It's not expecting us to accept the idea that there really are daimons that could haunt us or benefit us, anything like that. But I'm including this as part of the grammar to help us understand what this word is saying. And the ways in which happiness is an imperfect translation. As you can see from these aspects, there probably is no perfect translation of eudaimonia. And happiness certainly captures quite a bit of it. Okay. We have a sense of happy also as meaning fortunate, good fortune. Happy are those who, who have such and such quality. Even if they're suffering, they might be fortunate because of some value system that one holds. It's that idea of happiness that has to be included in happiness when we're looking at Aristotle's use. So this brings us to the third chapter on the three lives. In the fifth chapter, Aristotle proposes to survey the lives that people actually live and the opinions that the cultivated hold about these lives in order to find a clue as to the true conception of happiness. The three most favored lives are the lives of gratification, political activity, and study. We can see here that translating the conception of happiness into the conception of the most favored lives, or the idea of what the good life is, relies upon this idea that eudaimonia is something relatively stable that has to do with success in one's whole life and not just the episodic mood or feeling of the moment or of the day or of the hour of the week or the month even or the year, but of one's whole life. How does it apply to one's whole life? And Aristotle is here relying on happiness being understood in the sense in which it is understood as eudaimonia, as something that applies to one's life and whether one's life goes well. So to ask about the highest good is to ask about which life would be the best life overall. And the three most favored lives, most favored in the sense of the ones that are most favored in the opinions of the cultivated and also of the many, are gratification, political activity, and study. Gratification, political activity, and study. So a word on these is in order. The life of gratification is the life that is primarily devoted to pleasure seeking in and through the gratification of the appetites. This is the person who becomes a foodie, a wine connoisseur, a thrill seeker, who frequents the arena and the theater and pleasure excursions of various sorts. And of course, this person would also tend to be a sexual adventurer and hedonist and so forth. The life of political activity here that Aristotle is referring to doesn't necessarily mean the pursuit of political power and influence in our narrow modern sense, but it's closer to what we might call civic involvement. This might be a life of seeking and serving in public office, but one might also express their civic concern in some other way. For example, the person who follows this life might be one who initiates or volunteers for causes that will improve the city in some way. For example, by raising funds for a worthwhile public works project like improvements to the city walls. This would also include the work of the philanthropist who might provide food or shelter for the city's poor. All of this would be political activity in Aristotle's sense. Activity in the polis, not just in the government. About the life of study, Aristotle says little to nothing here, although later on it will turn out to be a central part of his answer. All that we can gather here is some hints from the Greek word itself, which is a form of theorein, which is the root of our word for theory. And this is cognate with the Greek word for seeing. So this we can infer is the kind of study that involves contemplation or theoretical insight. But he doesn't say any more about it here. Likewise, Aristotle mentions a fourth life later on in the chapter, which is the moneymaker's life. In other words, the life of business. Well, some people consider this to be an activity that's pursued for its own sake. Aristotle clearly regards that opinion as a form of foolishness. Money is only good for what it can purchase. It's not good in its own right. So One might pursue the life of business in order to have money to gratify the appetites and pursue the life of gratification. Or one might pursue business in order to have money to donate to civic causes, to finance civic causes, and get a new improved city gate named after you or something like that. But the pursuit of money merely for the sake of accumulating more and more money is absurd and irrational. In this chapter, the advances in Aristotle's inquiry concern the first two of the three lives. So the life of gratification is apparently rejected. He says, chapter 5, this is the second paragraph there in our text. The many, the most vulgar, would seem to conceive the good and happiness as pleasure, and hence they also like the life of gratification. In this they appear completely slavish, since the life they decide on is a life for grazing animals. Still, they have some argument in their defense, since many in positions of power feel as Sardanapalus felt and choose this life. So Aristotle badmouths the life of gratification as vulgar and animalistic and slavish. Nevertheless, he recognizes at least one of the cultivated, namely the Assyrian king and notorious Sybarite, Sardanapalus, was of a different opinion. But, he's the exception that proves the rule, seems to be the implication here. And I don't think there's really an argument here against leading a life of pleasure, pursuing gratification, except perhaps a hint that one is wasting one's human potential and failing to be all you can be if you spend all your time on pleasure rather than accomplishments. We'll see later on in the next video how Aristotle attempts to construct an argument around this idea, but he doesn't offer an argument here. Second, the life of political activity seems to fare much better than the life of gratification. So he says, Section 4, but the cultivated people, those who are active in politics, conceive the good as honor, since this is more or less the end normally pursued in the political life. This, however, appears to be too superficial to be what we are seeking, for it seems to depend more on those who honor than on the one honored, whereas we intuitively believe that the good is something of our own and hard to take from us. Further, it would seem they pursue honor to convince themselves that they are good. At any rate, they seek to be honored by prudent people, among people who know them, and for virtue. It is clear then that in their view, at any rate, virtue is superior to honor. So Aristotle is asking here implicitly why one pursues the political life or the life of civic involvement, and there appear to be two possible answers to this. On the one hand, there's fame, which he's just described here, which he rejects. He rejects it as an unstable motive, honor or fame in the city, good reputation, being honored. For one thing, it threatens to undermine the distinction between political activity in reality, as we might describe it, and political activity for show. If all you want is the credit, why do the political activity if you're not going to be recognized for it? Furthermore, the opinion of the cultivated is that honor that is not deserved or is from worthless people is worthless. For one thing, he says, it seems to be something that is hard to take from us. If you depend on your self-worth on being honored by other people, that's going to be easy to take from you because other people might change their opinion. So that's one respect in which the cultivated would regard honor just for its own sake as being worthless. What makes honor worthwhile is being recognized for the qualities and accomplishments that they actually have, that they've actually achieved. And that requires two things. It requires really achieving them, and it requires having an audience of worthy and discerning people who can recognize the worth of one's actions. So the political life in the true sense seems to be equivalent to the virtuous life, the life of civic virtue, as we might describe it. In section 6, he says, perhaps indeed one might conceive virtue more than honor to be the end of the political life. However, this is also apparently too incomplete to be the good, for it seems possible for someone to possess virtue but be asleep or inactive throughout his life, and moreover to suffer the worst evils and misfortunes. But if this is the sort of life he leads, no one would count him happy except to defend a philosopher's paradox. So, the life of political activity is in pursuit of honor, but honor as the sign or recognition of true virtue. And that raises the question, is the life of true virtue exercised in the various forms of civic involvement that I mentioned earlier, is that life the highest good? Is that life the happy life? And Aristotle says, well, it appears to be incomplete. It doesn't seem to have everything that's necessary because such a person could lead a life of civic involvement, but nonetheless through misfortune, the worst evils and misfortunes, through ill health, or through the fact of, let's say, after devoting his life to improving his city is destroyed in an earthquake, or through war or something like that. And we wouldn't say that that person led a successful life or had a happy life, Aristotle seems to be assuming. So it seems like the virtuous life lived in the exercise of civic involvement, well, it has a lot to be said for it. It doesn't seem to be the highest good all by itself. So there's a question mark placed over this. So what's been gained in this chapter? Well, the life of sheer pursuit of gratification is rejected, but on shaky grounds, I would say. The life of political activity in its truest form is seen to be the life of civic virtue pursued for its own sake, where any honors that are achieved are for the sake of having that virtue recognized, not just for honor's own sake. And this life does have a valid claim to being the happy life. It's approved of by the most cultivated, but it's got one major caveat, that it appears to be incomplete, since one still would need a degree of good fortune, avoiding suffering major evils in order for one's life to be happy. And then the life of study is still out there as a possible happy life, but that hasn't been discussed yet. So that's where we are as we end the 5th chapter of Book 1. Okay, so this leads to a second discussion question. How would you assess Aristotle's initial proposals about the options for the good life? What would you say is the happiest life of the ones he considers? Is Aristotle overlooking any possibilities? What considerations would you give in support of your own conclusion about the happiest life? How might Aristotle respond to these considerations? So once again, second discussion question, how would you assess Aristotle's initial proposals about the options for the good life? What would you say is the happiest life of the ones he considers? Is Aristotle overlooking any possibilities? What considerations would you give in support of your own conclusion about the happiest life? How might Aristotle respond to these considerations?